Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Drew Ramsey. I'm an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, and I'm founder of the Brain Food Clinic. I hope you'll join me as I speak with Jody, a patient who is suffering some long-term and long-haul consequences of COVID-19 as we discuss those and her mental health. My sense about our conversation is I wanted to hear some specifics. There are some aspects of your story I'm really curious about. If you could share with everyone a little bit about, in some ways, the thumbnail of who you are and what happened to you just at first with COVID.
Who I am is someone that I recognize now as an overcomer. I'll say this is not my first rodeo in terms of overcoming something life-changing. I grew up in Southern California, in Los Angeles. It was really kind of a wonderful childhood, although it wasn't perfect, and I don't think anyone's is. So I had some things to overcome in my childhood. And in my early 20s, I really put my focus into dealing with those issues and trying to build a really conscious life that revolved around my well-being, both physically and mentally. So I had tools that helped enable me to move cross-country. I'm 56 now, but I was 45 when I moved to New York City, and I completely changed careers. And it was a huge calculated risk, but I really rose to the occasion, and I became incredibly successful pretty shortly thereafter moving here to New York. So I have had experience of not having things go my way and finding my way out. What I didn't have prior to having COVID and long COVID was any kind of health crisis. And I could never have imagined that something like a virus could take me out. And I mean completely out. I'd never not overcome things. So I didn't worry too much about the pandemic. I was relieved that the city was shutting down because I was exhausted.
I appreciate you saying that. And I think a lot of people have had different experiences that, there are a lot of negative attributes of quarantine, but there are a lot of people who have felt fewer obligations, who felt more family time, who felt a little relief from the intensity of work. For all of your success, that also comes at a cost. You're busy, you're working all the time, every weekend is booked. So I think for many people, there was a little pause button that was mingled in with a lot of fear and anxiety and kind of confusing.
Yes, there was this initial sense of excitement because I wasn't sick at this point. And within 2 weeks, I myself came down with it. And so that was that moment where I think I was in denial. I think I thought, no. I'm a healthy person. I have no pre-existing conditions. I take excellent care of myself. I'm vegan for 5.5 years. I don't smoke. I don't drink. I don't do drugs. It was a moment of trust trying to be in denial. And I was listening to what the news was saying, which was it should only be 2 weeks unless you're obese or diabetic or any of those things. So I just kept holding on to this 2-week period. And when I passed that 2-week period and things started to get worse, I think I was still in denial.
Jody, if you could just take us back to that moment where you're counting down and you're hearing the recommendations, you're a healthy person, you're young, you're not in these kind of high-risk categories, and there's not a lot of information about this, what we now know is very deadly virus. And you cross day 12, day 13, day 14. Can you tell us a little bit about both the symptoms you're having, but also what begins to go on for you mentally and emotionally?
I had probably very early symptoms starting up March 8th, but they were so mild that I just disregarded it. It was just a little phlegmy throat. By March 27th is when I woke up and I felt like a truck had hit me. And that's when I knew, okay, this is COVID. I did a telehealth and I gave them my symptoms, which were just headache, fatigue, body aches. And they said, take Tylenol, stay hydrated, and sleep. That was my recommendation. So I thought, okay. And then into the second week, I started to have heart pain. So I did another telehealth call, and this was an ER doctor, and he said, if you're 55 years old and you have heart pain, you need to go to the ER. So I went in and I was terrified. It was like an out-of-body experience. And they finally got a stable EKG, and then they discharged me, and they gave me 2 Tylenol, and that was it. And they said, follow up with this cardiologist. And that was it. And so I came home, and unfortunately I reached out to that cardiologist the very next day, but because he was on the front lines, he didn't get back to me for about 2.5 weeks. And at that point I had stopped sleeping because the pain was so bad from the heart.
Such a strange time for everyone in healthcare. So much disruption and fear. Can you talk a little bit about the pericarditis and what how that has kind of sat with you?
The cardiologist that I was referred to, he just had me on aspirin, and he had given me a prescription for sleep for Xanax, which I didn't know anything about. It did put me to sleep. However, then I started to read up on it, and there's a high propensity for dependence. And so I was only on that for about 2 weeks, and then I weaned myself off, and that was icky and uncomfortable. I also just want to say, growing up, there was a huge stigma about medication in my family. No one had needed any medication. And actually, my grandmother was an alcoholic. So there was a huge stigma around medication and a lot of fear around medication.
And also around addiction. I mean, benzodiazepines
and addiction, yes.
bind to the same receptors in alcohol. And so oftentimes in families that have struggled with addiction or families that have been influenced by AA, there is a real hesitation around medication, but particularly benzos is an idea that they can be very addictive. You maybe have some genetics that predispose you towards that. So, and you were, sounds like kind of California hippie, growing your fruits and vegetables and doing Pilates and eating, lots of plants. So, as you said, up until this point, you really had been very intentional, as you said, of taking care of not just your physical, but also your mental and your spiritual health. Was there a sense kind of going into getting the benzodiazepine that, hey, this is a substance that can be a little addictive or sticky. We're going to put you on it for a while with the goal you're going to get great sleep. Then we're going to taper you off of it.
Nothing whatsoever.
Part of where there's so much confusion about these medicines is like, sometimes they can be really effective tools. I'm a psychiatrist, and so benzodiazepines are one of those tools that when people are agitated, they can't sleep. You're in this conflict now because there's so much misuse of them, that how they can be effectively deployed and how some of them are better than others and how patients really need to be guided onto how to initiate psychotropic or mental health affecting medications in a skilled way and how we start those and trial them, and if they don't work we stop them. I feel like that's so often missing in something like this, where what strikes me about your story is the feeling of you really being alone in the midst of all this.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if there's a moment where you felt that the healthcare community or the COVID care community that you've connected with finally kind of got together in a way where you felt less alone with this.
Well, cut to, I'm actually still on the Xanax because even though I had weaned myself off of it, by May 27th, the pericarditis had not resolved with any of the NSAIDs, and I was dropping weight rapidly, and I still wasn't sleeping, and I didn't want to go back to taking the benzos. So I crawled into his office when they finally opened, and he said, we're going to put you on a steroid. And I was really hesitant to take it. I was really hesitant. My body was screaming no.
For everyone watching, the thought is that you're having an inflammatory reaction to COVID-19. That has the pericarditis. You've got inflammation around your heart. It's chronic. It's not going away. They've tried an anti-inflammatory. Now you're going to get a steroid burst. Was the insomnia also getting explained in terms of part of a sequela of COVID? Was that getting explained as you worry too much, or you're too anxious, or was that just not being addressed?
From what I remember, the insomnia was because I was in so much pain. So there were nights that I just never slept because I was afraid I was going to die. It was very traumatic, highly traumatic to not sleep, to be in that amount of pain for so long. And then when I opened up his office, he prescribed that steroid. I was put on a pediatric dose, and within 4 days, they still call them internal tremors, but it was as if I was being electrocuted from my feet all the way up to the top of my head. So yes, the heart pain was less, but these internal tremors were unbelievable. So I didn't sleep again for 14 days straight. And I was terrified and suicidal. And I think one night I finally was like, I have to somehow get some sleep. So I took 0.5 of that Xanax, and it stopped the internal tremors. And I was able to get a couple hours of sleep. And you're going to roll your eyes at this. One neurologist said, well, to stop the internal tremors all day, she said, why don't we just put you on a slow release Xanax for the whole day? They have me up to 3 milligrams of Xanax. And I was absolutely out of my mind at that point. I was completely suicidal.
It feels like you're in a challenging place where allopathic medicine has given you some medicines that maybe have saved your life from the consequences of COVID, and at the same time haven't really fully served your needs. And it feels to me we're in a moment in time right now where there's a lot of conflict about allopathic medicine. Of when we need it, we're really grateful for all of this technology and all of these medicines, but it doesn't feel like individuals are as satisfied or it is getting the results as they'd like. And I was wondering if you could just share some of your thoughts on that.
I'm not grateful that I got the Xanax for the first time around for sleep. I would have preferred something a little less, aggressive. However, when the internal tremors showed up, that was the only thing that stopped him. And so it's very interesting how in the beginning I was like, I remember saying, this is a devil drug. and then when I really needed it, I was grateful to have it.
It's sort of hard in my profession because, first of all, I really appreciate that in your open-mindedness that I find oftentimes people have different experiences at different times in their lives, or medicine serve different purposes, but they're not often seen as tools. It's part of where there's so much stigma about mental health. But I really, I think it is challenging also when there is something that helps you, but it has side effects. And for us as physicians, so often we're thinking about the risks and the benefits, and we're really trying to balance those. But for just speaking to a patient today, who's having a great mood benefit, but having some sexual performance problems. It's a really challenging spot to be when you're struggling with your mental health, and so it is a difficult thing to sort through. That, as I noted earlier, I think people often are left alone in, as opposed to being within a process to maybe process some of this.
One neurologist said, well, to stop the internal tremors all day, because they would come on around 3 o'clock during the day and then just last all night. She said, why don't we just put you on a slow release Xanax for the whole day? And I was like, okay. They have me up to 3 milligrams of Xanax. That was horrible. And I was absolutely out of my mind at that point. I was completely suicidal. I would wake up and want to die. I had thoughts when I would go to the grocery store to get groceries, and I remember standing on the corner to cross over to my apartment, and I had 2 bags of groceries, and I thought, I should just walk in front of that bus. That'll be the end of this. And the only thought that stopped me was, wow, this gets me so emotional. I have a cat, and I thought, oh, but I have to go feed Greta. Like, that was the only sane thought that I had, and it kept me alive. And I remember getting home and being like, oh my gosh, what has happened to me? I can't believe I had that thought of not wanting to be here. But that's what those drugs did to my brain. Very quickly thereafter, I connected to a functional medicine doctor who was able to reassure me that he would do what he could to help me to taper down off of this. So I started to slowly taper down off of it. But I guess it's just been a year of navigating, tapering off it, and still needing to be able to get sleep. So I've had to add different things into it. Eventually, the pericarditis, it came back twice. So it's been a really long road. I still have heart pains if I overexert, but I'm not on any of those medications for the pericarditis. And I'm on only 0.5 of the Xanax at this point at night, just to not disrupt my sleep.
I think it's such a disturbing and upsetting moment for individuals to see that you're really on a precipice. And it doesn't sound silly to me what you say. I've heard all kinds of things protect people from things that, jobs or children, but also pets are often really protective. When I have patients struggling with their mental health and, they're really attached to an animal, it reassures me as a clinician. So it makes sense to me. And I'm so glad that you didn't step in front of that bus and you're here to share your story with us. I wonder if you can share with us a little more about mental health. I mean, you're going from a kind of very, March 2020, February 2020, very powerful stance. You've been through a huge transition. You've come to New York. I know what that's like. You've found success in New York. I know what that's like. 'Cause nothing feels quite like that. And you're really, in some ways, on top of the world. And then you slowly begin to experience extreme pain, lots of symptoms. Your mental health slips. You share with us, you end up feeling really quite suicidal, like stepping up in front of a bus, and you're in a place where there are buses. You're a few feet away from really a horrible outcome. Can you share with us some of how you get out of that? Because I think so many people who are struggling, not just with COVID, but also with chronic illness, hit these moments where I'm not really sure what the next step is. And because it's chronic, it's not like a lot of goals. Like, I'm going to be done with this. It'll be over. There's a finish line.
When I finally connected to the long hauler groups and the Zoom, that was a big relief because I knew that I wasn't making any of this up, that I was not alone. And I had been a member and still am a member of Al-Anon for over 30 years. So I understood the dynamic of group support. I understood the value of listening to other people and not telling them advice but just holding space for someone's emotions. And so that's what I started with, was that I just allowed myself to be vulnerable. I allowed all of the fear and the grief, the unending grief, to be held in that space. And I got a lot of love back from that. I got a lot of people saying that I was speaking what they couldn't say. And so that was incredibly helpful. I started journaling even more than I ever had before. I had to dismantle my entire spiritual belief system because the God or higher power that I had going into this experience is very different than, where I'm at now. I'm sort of deconstructing all of that.
Very different place than where you thought you would be when you maybe began to be worried and then had severe symptoms and then have been struggling with this, that there'd also be a type of spiritual transformation for you.
Definitely. I really had to look death in the face. I had a huge relapse this summer that was horrific with the chronic fatigue. And I didn't want to live at that point. And I just, for about 3.5 months, had to just be with that pain. And I was really vocal about that. And also being able to share that in the groups and being able to find a therapist that had gone through a chronic illness. It gave me space to talk about the things that most people don't want to talk about.
I wanted to know if there are any messages you have for individuals who are struggling with long haul COVID or struggling with some symptoms and confused about them. What would be some initial steps that you'd recommend?
What has helped me is to not put the pressure on myself and my nervous system and my body to hurry up and get well. That this is a journey of mind, body, and soul. There is a lot of value in that. There are jewels along the path. And in that lesson, I've been incredibly humbled. And it helps me on a day-to-day basis really appreciate, not that I didn't appreciate my health before, but I think I appreciate my grit, my strength, and my willingness to love and support myself despite all the obstacles that were being thrown at me.
It strikes me that right now everyone is really hungry to move on. And I think that really presents a big challenge for us because there's so much grief to process. And as we get distance, for a lot of people, I think grief emerges. So much has changed for so many people. But in all of us moving on, what I'm, I guess, wondering is how individuals can be more aware of who around them is struggling with long haul symptoms. Because it seems that one of the things that you've encountered from a lot of people is disbelief.
I think about this quite a bit because, unfortunately, I'm not cleared for the vaccines. I have a high clot risk factor, genetic factor, and I won't
So
be
I
able.
understand you'd like to get the vaccine, but it's been medically recommended that you don't. And so you're in this very small percentage of a population. And some individuals I've spoken with and heard from who, have a medical condition where they're not an anti-vaxxer, they're not, but they're really getting like this could actually not work out for you. And so, can you tell us a little bit about what that's like? How to,
Sure.
how people either make assumptions or treat you or process that?
Well, initially, I thought I was going to. Subsequently, this summer, I had done some more genetic testing, and we found out that I have a genetic clotting factor that was even prior to COVID. And so I was told, definitely do not get the J&J. And then with the other two, the mRNAs, the other doctor was like, well, I'm not comfortable with those in regards to your other genetic profile. So that's why I've been waiting. And I will say there was a lot of, I have people still who are not long haulers who will still like, well, why don't you get the vaccine? We hear it cures COVID or long COVID. And that has been really frustrating because the verdict is still out. And in America, there's no collecting of data in regards to how many of us there are. And that right there tells me that we are not being seen.
Jody, how do you think, given there's such a diversity of symptoms, how do you think people can either better organized or better be aware of long haulers and what they're struggling with?
I would want to shine a light on the discrepancy between what you think is happening and what's really happening. And I would want to open up a conversation about the inequality there and how this group of chronically, and let me backtrack and say that chronic illness is stigmatized. Chronic illness community has been suffering for decades. And I myself had no idea about those communities. I had no idea about the chronic illness community of MECCFS. I had no idea that they've been suffering for decades without any real treatment. So I was incredibly humbled when those communities opened their doors to us and said, we will listen to you. We will support you. We will, we're here for you. So at this point, it's almost like I would hope that I would be an advocate for those chronic illness communities to say, like, we need to take steps as a country and as a society to recognize these people and to help them and to not push it aside in terms of acknowledgement.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jody. I mean, it reminds me so much of the mental health community, of how over the last decade there's been such an opening up and awareness of what's really always been there, and kind of more of an acknowledgement and more conversation that has led to lots more awareness and lots more action. In mental health, we're always unraveling really complex situations. And so as I listen to Jody's story, I'm thinking about the amount of support she needed and then got. I'm thinking about the way that she really had to mobilize and get very active as a patient. And then there uh, are clusters of symptoms that travel together. She's not sleeping and she's feeling alone and feeling really desperate and a tremendous amount of physical pain. It's not surprising that there are more severe symptoms that begin to show up. I think a lot of us can imagine or approximate being in that situation and beginning to have some thoughts of not wanting to be here, not wanting to be in that life, or maybe not a full suicidal thought of wanting to take your life, but not wanting to be here or in this situation anymore. I think a lot of individuals experienced that strain of thoughts during the pandemic. The way that we disentangle it in mental health is by being thoughtful and careful and listening better than any other field of medicine, and trying to really be active listeners and then do something with that information. Help individuals feel that they are within a framework, that we might not have all the answers, may not have the answers today, but we have a next step, and that we're committed to be with individuals as they are restoring their mental health and restoring full clarity of their sense of who they are, all of their faculties, a sense of a stable mood, a sense of control over worry, and then also equipping them with tools. We also know that individuals who have chronic illnesses, there are going to be good days and there are going to be bad days. And if we can really do our best in mental health to acknowledge that and to help really destigmatize that mental health is not something that just 20% of the patients or people have out there in the world, that famous statistic 1 in 5, that mental health is really something that all of us need to cultivate within ourselves, within our families, and within our communities. And when we all get aligned with that, we're all committed to promoting mental health. That's when I think that we will really know we've defeated stigma, and when I think more patients are going to have access, and all of us will really be able to achieve our full potential.